The job does not have to go badly to lose profit. That is the dangerous part. The crew shows up, the work gets done, the customer is happy. The invoice goes out, everything looks normal, but behind the scenes, profit is getting eaten. A few extra labor hours, one more material run, a small delay, a little cleanup that was not included, fuel, overhead disposal, and admin time nobody accounted for. By the time you realize the job was thinner than expected, the work is already done. That is the problem. If no one is tracking the leak while the job is happening, you only find out after the money is gone. I'm Josh Savage, founder of Savage Financials. I help insulation contractors understand where cash, profit, and job margins are getting squeezed inside of the business. And one of the biggest problems I see is owners looking at job profitability too late. They wait until the job is finished, they wait until the invoice is sent, they wait until the month is over, then they wonder why the bank account still feels tight. But profit does not disappear all at once. It leaks out in small pieces while the job is happening. That is why tracking labor, materials, extras, and overhead material matters before the job is already closed. I had a contractor who was a new client at the time, and one of the first things I wanted to understand was what was actually happening at the job level. They were busy, they had work, jobs were getting completed, customers were paying. The owner kept seeing the same thing happen. He would price a job expecting a certain margin, the job would seem to go fine, and then once everything made its way through the books, there just wasn't as much left as he expected. And this wasn't happening on one obviously bad project. That would have been easier. If one job goes completely sideways, everybody knows why. You had to redo a bunch of work, you completely missed something in the estimate, that a job took 2 weeks longer than expected. That's easy to point at. What concerned me was that this was happening across normal jobs. So one of the first things I did was start pulling completed jobs one by one. But I didn't just want the estimate on one side and the final costs on the other. That tells me where the job ended. It doesn't necessarily tell me how it got there. So for each project, I started laying the job out across a timeline, basically a time board of the project. When did the job start? What stage was it supposed to be in during each part of the schedule? How many labor hours were we expecting during that stage? When were materials purchased? When were subcontractors coming in? When did the project move from one phase into another? Then I started aligning the actual costs and labor up against that timeline. And eventually we started tracking the variances by stage too. Not just labor is over, materials are over, but where are they over? Demolition or prep over budget? Did the framing stage come in where expected? Did the middle of the project run cleanly and then finishing blow through the labor budget? Were material overruns happening early, or were we consistently getting surprised when we reached a certain stage? That made jobs much easier to understand, because now I wasn't just looking at a finished project and saying labor was 50 hours over. I could see when those 50 hours started appearing and what the crew was actually doing when it happened. The first project we went through in detail was a residential remodel where they converted an attached garage into finished living space. On the surface, it was a good job. The homeowner was happy. They got paid. There wasn't a major mistake. Nobody tore out finished work and rebuilt it. There wasn't some giant unbilled change order, but the profit was several $1,000s lower than the original estimate said it should have been. When I lined the project up on the timeline, something became obvious pretty quickly. The beginning of the job wasn't really the problem. The early work was tracking fairly close. The crew got mobilized. The initial material came in, the first phase of labor was pretty close to what had been expected. Then the job got into the middle stages and labor started drifting. There was one Friday where they had 4 guys there and they were supposed to be moving into drywall, but one section of framing wasn't ready to close. A few things had to be corrected first. Nothing major, 2 guys handled it. The other 2 shifted to what they could do elsewhere. Then everybody got back onto what they were originally supposed to be doing. Nobody would have described that as a disaster. They fixed it and moved on. But on the timeline, you could see it. The job didn't move as far forward that day as labor hours said it should have. And because they were tracking the job by stage, that labor overrun didn't just disappear into the total job number. We could see that the variance started around the transition between framing and drywall. And shortly after that, we saw a material run. They were short on a few things they needed. One guy left the job, drove to the supplier, got the material, and came back. Again, completely normal when you're standing on the job. But now I'm paying for that guy while he's driving. I'm paying for him while he's waiting. I'm paying for the truck. I'm paying for the fuel. And depending on what he went to get, the rest of the crew may not be moving through the planned work as efficiently until he gets back. Then a few days later, there's another material run. Different items, the same thing. And because I had the purchases sitting against the timeline instead of just sitting in one material total at the end of the job, those trips stood out. Then we got toward the end of the project and another pattern showed up. Cleanup started taking longer than what had been effectively been allowed for, because the garage was attached to the house. The homeowner and their kids were regularly using the same side of the property. The crew was being careful about keeping the work area and the path alongside it clean, which they should have been doing. But there's a lot of days where two guys were spending another 20 or 30 minutes getting debris swept out, sweeping the pathway, making sure nothing was left there, and left where the family was walking. 20 minutes doesn't look important in isolation, but when you put the days next to each other on a timeline, you could see the hours stacking up towards the end of the project. Then there's an additional dump run. They had disposal in the original estimate. They just ended up with more debris than expected. Somebody loaded it, drove it, disposed of it, came back. There was labor attached to it, truck costs attached to it, fuel, disposal fees. Again, not a major event, but now I could see exactly where it happened in the project and what else is happening around it. By the time we finished reconstructing that job, we could explain most of the missing margin. But one job wasn't enough. That project, or whether I was looking at how the company operated. So we did the same thing with the next job, then the next one. Original estimate compared against actual costs, against actual labor, and this time on a timeline. Now the stage level variances. Where was the job when costs started moving away from the estimate? What phase of the work were they in? Did that phase itself run over? And was the same thing happening on other projects? That's when the patterns became much more useful. Material runs started showing up across several jobs, not always for some huge shortage, a box of something, a few additional pieces, something that had been underestimated, something they realized they needed once they were already into that phase. We started seeing that those trips were clustering around certain stages of the work. That tells me something very different than material is usually a little over budget. Maybe the problem isn't our overall material pricing. Maybe we're not planning material requirements for that stage particularly well, and we don't get it to the crew on time. We saw something similar with labor. Some projects would start almost exactly where we expected, then they'd begin losing hours in the middle. Other jobs were tracking well until the finishing stages, and then the margin started getting eaten during punch work, cleanup, little corrections, disposal, and all the things required to actually close the job. That's much more actionable than simply saying our labor estimates are too low. Maybe they're not too low across the entire job. Maybe the beginning is priced almost perfectly. Maybe the middle is fine. Maybe we're consistently underpricing the final stage by 8 or 10%. Now I have actual data telling me where the problem is, and building the jobs this way gave us something else almost automatically, a WIP schedule. WIP just means work in progress. In plain English, it's basically a live list of every job you've started but haven't finished yet, showing where each job is, how much work you've completed, and what you've spent so far and what's still left to do. Once I already have the jobs laid across timelines of labor, material, stage, and progress tied to them, that WIP schedule becomes pretty natural. This job is early. This one is halfway through. This one should be wrapping up. Here's how much cost we've put in each. Here's roughly how much work has actually been completed. Here's the stage each one is in. And here's how it's performing against what we expected at that point. Now we're not waiting for the project to close before we know there's a problem. If the framing stage is supposed to use 80 labor hours and we've already used 75 with a meaningful amount of framing still left, we can see that while the job is happening. If the finishing stage is halfway done, has already used almost the entire material allowance for that stage, we know something is off. That made planning ahead much easier. We could see which jobs were likely to need more labor than expected. We could see where material purchases were likely to come in heavier. We could see which projects were tracking cleanly and which ones needed attention before they created a cash or scheduling problem. Now, setting all of this up took a decent amount of work in the beginning. We had to define the stages. We had to decide how labor and material should be budgeted across those stages. We had to organize the historical jobs. We had to build the timelines and actually connect the financial information to what had happened operationally. It wasn't something I threw together in 15 minutes, but the work was front loaded. Once the structure existed, maintaining it was a much smaller amount of effort. Jobs were already being run. Labor was already being recorded. Material was already being purchased. Now we had somewhere useful to put that information. And that gave the contractor something they really hadn't had before. data, not guessing about how much margin they probably needed. Actual data showing what different types of projects tended to require. Actual data showing which stages regularly came in over budget. Actual data showing which estimates were accurate and which assumptions needed to change. So when we priced future work, we weren't just saying, we should probably add a little more margin because these jobs seem to run over. We could see where the additional margin was actually needed. And just as importantly, we could see where the answer wasn't raising the price. Sometimes the data showed us an operational problem that could be improved: material planning, cleanup, supplier runs, sequencing, stage transition. Now there were two ways to improve margin: price the real cost correctly and reduce the cost that shouldn't be there in the first place. That's really what changed with that client. When we started, the question was, why did these jobs keep coming in thinner than we expect? After going through the projects one by one, mapping them by time and stage, and then building that into the way active jobs are tracked, we could answer a much better question. Where's the margin leaking? When is it happening? And can we do something about it before the job is finished? The lesson here is that job costing is only useful if it changes the decision. If all you know is that a job finished at a lower margin than expected, that's hindsight. Useful, but limited. What matters is being able to answer, where did the job start going off plan? Was it labor? Was it material? Was it a certain stage? Was it an operational issue? Or was the estimate itself wrong? That's why I like stage level tracking so much. It gives you context around the variance. A total labor overrun tells you that something happened. A stage level labor overrun tells you where to look. And when you repeat that across enough jobs, you stop reacting to isolated messes and start seeing the operating pattern of the business. Maybe the beginning of the job is consistently fine, maybe framing is fine, maybe material is fine, but closeout keeps eating margins. Now you have something specific to attack. Maybe you need to price more labor into closeout. Maybe your crews are spending too much time on punch work. Maybe you're making too many final material runs. Maybe disposal is consistently underestimated. Maybe too many small corrections are getting pushed to the end. The point is, now you're fixing the actual problem instead of just adding more margin everywhere and hoping that covers it. The same data also makes quoting better. Once you have enough completed jobs behind you, you can stop relying so heavily on instinct. You can say, this type of project usually needs many labor hours in this stage. This stage tends to run heavier on material. This type of job consistently needs more margin because the variability is higher. Now your pricing starts getting backed by your own operating history. That's much stronger than copying what you did on the last quote and then adding a little extra because you feel like you might need it. And the other major benefit is planning, because once the active jobs are sitting in the same system, you're not just using the data after the fact. You can see which jobs are starting to drift while they're still open. If one job is burning labor faster than expected, that affects more than that job. It can affect the crew schedule next week. It can affect whether another job starts on time. It can affect payroll. It can affect material purchases. It can affect cash. So live job tracking gives you a chance to adjust the rest of the business before the problem carries over. That's where the WIP schedule becomes valuable. Again, WIP is just a plain English view of all the jobs that are still in progress, where each one stands, what has been spent, and what's left. That gives you a much better picture of what the next few weeks actually look like. Not just, we have a lot of work, but which jobs are healthy? Which ones are drifting? Which ones are about to need more labor? Which ones are likely to need more cash? Which ones should be closing? Which ones are hanging around longer than they should? That's useful information. And yes, building the system takes effort up front, but that's exactly why it's valuable. Once the stages, timelines, and tracking structure are in place, the ongoing effort is small compared with the amount of information you get back. Every completed job adds more data. Every active job gives you another live comparison. And over time, the business gets better at two things at once: pricing the real cost of the work and removing the operational waste that should have been there in the first place. That's the real payoff. You stop guessing how much margin you need. You stop guessing where your jobs go wrong. You stop waiting until the month is over to find out something slipped. You have actual evidence. And once you have that, the conversation changes from, why does the bank account always feel tighter than it should, to, here's exactly where the margin is leaking, here's when it starts, and here's what we're going to change. The scary part is not one bad job. The scary part is repeating the same leak over and over without seeing it. A little labor over in here, a missed material cost there, a small extra that never gets billed, a payment that comes in late, an overhead cost that never made it into the quote. That is how busy jobs turn into thin margins. And if you do not know where the leak is, you cannot fix it. Next month, we'll come back to see these same problems again with a more action-focused angle. starting with what happens when you keep quoting blind and absorbing mistakes. And if you want help seeing where your jobs are leaking profit before it gets worse, book a call here at savagefinancials.com.